So, although it's now turned off your video. So, oh, there you go. It's all working now.
Yeah, it takes a moment. It clicks in and then clicks out again. It
yeah.
always does that.
Yeah. So I guess I'd love to just start by, hearing a little bit more about you and, your background, how you ended up in China, and what's your story, basically.
Okay. I've been in China, in Guangdong, southern China now since 2004. So we're coming up to 16 years. I arrived in October, so just a couple of months short of 16 years. I came here because I had an idea. I was made redundant. I worked for an Australian company. Actually, I worked for a British company in Australia. And I was the general manager in that. So when that company was taken over, I was one of the people that the new owners of the company said, well, we don't really need all these managers. And I got a redundancy package. And I was quite happy about that. Everything was cool. I put away some money in the bank and I decided to go to school and learn how to be a teacher. The idea being that I would travel the world and do a bit of teaching and just get paid for being a bit of a beach bum, to be honest. It didn't work that way. I found a job that I liked. I found an environment that I enjoyed living in. I came to China really for a one-year contract. It was with an Australian company. I finished my contract and it wasn't going to be renewed. It was always a one-year contract, and I decided that I liked living here. It was not what I expected. It was far better. It was a really different environment to my own expectations. So I was very happy. I found another job. I met a lady and we got married. I'm now been married for 11 years. And so relatively happy in a fairly normal environment. I have one issue with living in China, that I'm now 62 years of age, and at that age I can't get a working visa anymore. So effectively I'm retired now. So I've spent a lot of my time cycling, a lot of my time writing. I've done a lot less cycling this year because of obvious restrictions with travel. I have family in the UK. I have family in Australia. I'm British-born Australian citizen. One of the things that's probably worth pointing out for the record is I'm actually a former police officer. I spent 10 years as a British police officer. And
really,
what that? Yeah. I worked 5 years in central London. I've been involved in things like royalty protection, diplomatic protection. I was a member of both groups, which they call royalty protection with diplomatic protection. Then I moved out to Essex, and I was just a general police officer in Essex, just doing normal police duties. I've got some criminal investigation background. I've got some observational training. I've got some psychology training. I've got a master's degree in cross-cultural management, which is something I've done here. It was a 2-year project that I took on a few years ago, and I based my dissertation was looking at a British workplace environment using Western management philosophy and managing under a Chinese workplace psychology. So, it means that I basically looked a lot at the way that Chinese mind works. I've studied a lot about China and Chinese people. And I think that background tells you that I'm not an idiot, but it doesn't tell you about, the thing that we're going to talk about today is mostly Xinjiang, I think, rather than my bike. Other people want to interview me about the fact that I've ridden a bike across China 3 times. So once from southeast to northwest, once from north to south, and again from northwest back to southeast. 3 different really long bike rides. And I've probably covered in excess of 30,000 kilometers on a bike in China.
How amazing.
So, yeah, a lot of people like to talk about that, but the fact
I am interested in hearing about it too.
Okay, that's a different story, I suspect. But the thing is, I found myself just recently. We did a bike ride in September, October last year. My wife, a friend of ours, and myself, 3 of us. We flew to Urumqi and we rode bikes out of there and across the length of Xinjiang into Gansu, and then from Gansu we headed back down to the southeast. What that means is we spend a lot of time on our bikes in
Yeah.
Xinjiang. And what I've observed is, I'm not going to say that any of the narrative that I've seen is wrong. I'm saying that it seems to be extremely biased and unfact-checked. And if you read anything that I've written, you'll see that I don't say things are wrong. I say, that doesn't look right. That's not what we saw. And I'm finding there are literally thousands and thousands of people writing and reporting on Xinjiang without ever having been there. So all I'm doing is challenging the narrative. I'm not defying the narrative. I'm certainly not denying there are problems in Xinjiang. There are problems there. And I'm not going to deny that. And I know that some people are estranged. I know that you've met people in Turkey. You mentioned that, and I've read some of your writing about that. And what it seems to me is, even yourself, you're basing everything that you read, everything that you write is being based on what's being told to you by people who have some kind of agenda to put forward. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that these families are separated. It's a terrible thing. The fact that there are people who can't contact their mother or their father or their brother or their sister, it's terrible. I agree. I'm not an observer. I'm not a journalist. I'm not an investigator. I'm a guy who cites. So everything I say is based on what I've observed, rather than what I know. And I don't try and say that's wrong or that's stupid or that's ridiculous. But I can say one thing for certain. All the time that we were in Xinjiang on our bikes, we saw really heavy security. You go through security checks several times a day. Every time in the desert, there's no police. You're traveling across the Taklamakan Desert and there's nobody there. We spent one of our nights sleeping on the floor of a shed next to the restaurant. We spent another night sleeping under a culvert, a drainage culvert in the road. We spent another night in tents behind a service station on the side of the road. Nobody ever asked us what we were doing. Nobody ever stopped us from doing it. Nobody ever asked to see any of our photographs. And nobody ever said, you can't go here or you can't go there. We went through every single police check, was very friendly, very normal. It was a pain in the butt, don't get me wrong. If you're traveling on a bike, you want to get from here to here, and it's 100 kilometers, and you've only got 8 hours of daylight. Actually, it's more than that, it's 10 hours of daylight. But by the time you've stopped 2 or 3 times for rests, and then you're just arriving in town, and it takes an hour to get through the police security, that's a pain in the butt. But at no stage were they ever abusive. They were never rude. They were never aggressive. They never asked to see our photographs. I had a camera mounted on the front of my bike. I had a drone camera, which I didn't use very often. I certainly didn't use it in Xinjiang, but that was only because it's too windy. You can't put a drone up. It's windy, so we just left it in the bag and rode. But they never asked to see it.
Do you think you would have had issues if you tried to put the drone up? Do you think anything would have happened?
I would have crashed the drone. That's about all. I guess it would have depended where. I'm quite sure there are sensitive areas. Xinjiang is a massive place, massive. We could have gone to the desert and been 100 kilometers from any building and taken the drone out, flown it, and followed us, and we could have done some great riding shots, and nobody would have cared a jot about that. If we'd done it on the outskirts of Turpan or Hami, perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps they would have felt differently, and if they'd seen it up there, the police might have come along and said, what are you doing here? Let's have a look. And if there's nothing there, then they would have said, that's okay. If I was covering something sensitive, I don't know. They might have asked me to delete it. But at no stage did anybody. At no stage. They all knew that we had it. They knew I had a camera. My wife had a camera on her bike. I had a camera on my bike. We each had mobile phones with cameras in. And nobody asked to see it. At no stage did anyone say, where have you been? What have you been doing? What did you see? Show us your cameras. And this flies completely in the face of this narrative that everybody says Xinjiang is in total lockdown and no one can go there and ask questions. Well, we
Right.
did. We stopped at restaurants and we asked questions. One of my favorite questions, particularly in Urumqi, particularly there, when I was riding around there or wandering around doing some shopping, if we talked to anybody, I always said, "What do you think about all this security? What a pain in the neck." And they
Hmm.
said, "We feel safe."
Hmm.
Now, they didn't say we don't like it. They said we feel safer than we used to be. There's
Hmm.
no bombs, there's no terrorists, there's no attacks. We feel
Yeah.
safer.
Hmm.
Now, this is coming from people who have to, in order to get in and out of their shopping centers, go through metal detectors. In order to get in and out of their living gardens, the communities in which they live, have to go through a video identification, scan of the identity card, and then through a turnstile, an electronic turnstile. So
Hmm.
this is how secure that Xinjiang is. Every
Right.
single school is the same. It's surrounded by barbed wire fences. It has what I would call tank traps out the front. When I was working in London during the IRA campaigns in the
Hmm.
1970s and 1980s, we didn't have this level of security at all. I wish we had.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, as a former police officer, seeing this, hugely, closely, close grid of security, what were your thoughts as a police officer? Do you think this is how a society should be run and should be kept
No,
secure?
not at all, but it is secure. You have to really look at this from two different perspectives. There are two different perspectives to look at it. One is China is the safest place in the world to live, work, play, visit, travel. That's one aspect. The other
Hmm.
aspect is China is the most totalitarian, authoritarian state in the world because they manage every aspect of your life. Now, depending on where you're coming from and what you're doing, that could be really
Hmm.
good or really bad. In my own personal case, I don't do anything wrong. I live in China. I abide by the Chinese rules. When the government says you do this, this is what we do. So I have nothing to fear about the fact that my my WeChat, you probably use WhatsApp, we use WeChat. My
Hmm.
WeChat's been monitored. But so what? It's going to be the most boring job in the world to monitor someone like me because there's just nothing interesting there to see. So I don't have a problem with it. But I do see why some people who are concerned about human rights and the suppression of human rights would have a problem with it. But I don't see that it affects 90% of the people. Now, I live with and talk to Chinese people every single day, and they all say the same thing. They like their government. They like what is happening. They can't
Hmm.
understand why Americans are out in the street shouting and shooting each other. And that's the news that we're seeing over here. I know it's not happening everywhere every day,
Hmm.
but the news that we're seeing here is that America is in chaos and China is saying, well, look how well organized we are. We got
Hmm.
through COVID. We had
Hmm.
80,000 sick people and 4,000 deaths. America's getting that every day right now.
Mm.
So
Absolutely.
the consequences of having an organized authoritarian government in a communal society is that it works very, very well. You can't impose democracy on people who like what they have. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying everybody in China loves their government. Don't get me wrong. There
Hmm.
are people who don't, of course. But if you just go about your day-to-day business, doing what you do every single day, your government gives you total freedom to enjoy your life.
Hmm.
Much more freedom in the West. When I
Hmm.
lived in the UK, I couldn't go to my local corner shop, buy a bottle of beer, walk out and open it and drink it. I can here. I can sit outside the corner shop and have a drink if I want to.
Hmm.
Drinking in the street is a great example of a very, very small, moderate freedom that is just available. Eating food in the street, it's widely accepted. People can
Hmm.
have these freedoms. So what do we give up? We don't have Facebook. Well, we
Hmm.
can if we want. We
Yeah.
can have a VPN. People say, but VPN is illegal and Facebook is banned. Well, no. Facebook has refused to meet the standards that China wants, which is to allow them
Hmm.
access, so
Yeah.
therefore it's not allowed. But VPNs are not illegal. They're not
But you're,
encouraged.
but Jerry, you're in a much more privileged position. If you were a Uyghur in Xinjiang and you downloaded a VPN, you would be immediately arrested. That is that is just the truth. People have been arrested for much less for having WhatsApp on their phone. From people who I've spoken to who've been released from detention in Xinjiang, they've cited much smaller things than that.
Let me ask you a question about that. How do they get released and then get out of the country from this authoritarian state? This confuses me.
It depends who they are. There's hardly anyone who's been released, obviously, but the woman who I've spoken to in the most depth, or two of the women are Zumret Dawood and Gulbahar Jalilova. Both of them had connections with other countries. So Zumret's husband is a Pakistani citizen, so he pressured the Chinese authorities via the Pakistani embassy, and same with Gulbahar, she's a Kazakhstan citizen, so she was allowed to, and often the releases tend to be people who have connections with other countries. So that was how they managed to leave Xinjiang and get out. But they, Gulbahar kept a notebook. It was pages and pages and pages of the women that she met in these detention centers she spent in Urumqi, and all of the reasons why they were detained or why they were told they had been detained.
Yeah, I've heard about this notebook.
Yeah,
it's been on, part of it's been online. Now, the question I would ask there is, if we're living in this totalitarian state, how did she get that notebook out?
No, she wrote it down from her memory.
Okay. So, I accept that. Now, you're right, but have you been on YouTube and just type in the word Uyghur? Because if you go on YouTube, you'll find there are literally hundreds of Uyghurs in Xinjiang posting YouTubes. Now, you could argue that that's government propaganda and they're allowed to do it because they support the government. Yes. And that is actually what 90% of the Uyghurs are looking like. I mean, I don't know about the 10%. And certainly, I'm gonna actually say this is absolute rubbish. There are not 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. That is that's total baloney. Go back and research Adrian Zenz and research the man's research. It's wrong, I'm sure. It seems to me that almost every single claim about the Uyghurs and about the oppression comes from one of three sources. One source is Adrian Zenz. Now, even the CIA and the Department of Homeland Security have taken Adrian Zenz's information and they've legitimized it. And it's not legitimate. This is a German guy who doesn't speak Chinese, who has, by his own admission, only been to Xinjiang once in 2007 as a tourist. Now, this is a guy who doesn't seem to know very much and is led by a mission from God to bring down the Chinese Communist government. Now, forgetting all of his other stuff, which if you go online, his rapture stuff and find out about him, and this is not me being conspiratorial, he's done this to himself. Now, everything that he's printed comes from a small, lots of documents for sure. And yes, there's lots of purchase orders for barbed wire and cattle prods and things like that. And yes, there's a whole lot of different reasons why people would do this. It's a secure area. It needs every school there, every government building, every service petrol station has got massive security around it. So consequently, there are massive purchase orders for fencing and for this kind of thing. So that's one source that I would absolutely refute. He's taken an interpretation of some data, and that interpretation has now become the mainstream. Now, that I think is wrong, and I think the CIA and departments in America who are purporting to say that this is true have a different agenda. They don't want to say that, they don't want to come to China and have a look. And that's what I keep saying. Go have a look for yourself. And I know for a fact that United Nations did send a counterterrorism guy to have a look. And his report was quite favorable, except that it's been shelved because he didn't look at the human rights issues. But his report about terrorism is favorable. So that's one thing. Then you've got the other two sources of information seem to be satellite imagery taken from 3 miles up and analyzed by this organization, mostly ASPI in Australia. ASPI are a think tank that are funded by weapons manufacturers. They don't have an agenda that supports a peaceful coexistence in this world. Take a look at ASPI's funding page. It's Lockheed Martin, it's Raytheon, it's General Electric, it's all the manufacturers of weapons. And they're giving advice to people like the Australian government, the US Senate, and they're getting paid for giving that advice at the same time as they're collecting funding from Lockheed Martin and their like. So that tells me there's something that needs to be looked a little bit deeper into. And the third source is the dissident people, like the people that you've met. Now, I'm not disputing that what they're saying is true or untrue. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't call them a liar, and I would hope they wouldn't call me a liar for what I've experienced. So, and like I said at the beginning, I have no doubt whatsoever there are problems in Xinjiang. But there are problems, and here's a little bit of whataboutism. There are problems in every single country that has terrorism. How does the Chinese government handle it? How does the American government handle it? The American government goes out, drops bombs and shoots people. The Chinese government locks them up and educates them. Honestly, which is a better way? Neither is good, but is there a perfect way to handle this kind of issue in your own country? I don't know that there is.
What for you would be an acceptable number of Uyghurs to be in these camps?
There is no acceptable number of Uyghurs to be in a camp. If you commit a crime, you go to prison. If you don't commit a crime, you don't go to prison. That's the way I view that. There is no acceptable number, so you can quote me on that. I mean, I'm absolutely adamant there is no acceptable number of a Uyghur to be put in a camp. But are there Uyghurs and are there camps? And this is the issue. Nathan Russer and I have had long discussions about this. He's the analyst who analyzes the stuff from 3 Miles High for ASPI. And he says, I can give you the coordinates of 250 camps. And I say, give them to me. Next time I'm there, I'll go and cycle past and have a look. Because right now, I never saw one. That doesn't mean they aren't there. It's a huge place. But we did cycle down some very, very long stretches of open roads. And yeah, we saw things like there's oil fields, there's gas fields, there's military installations. There's a lot of things out there. And yes, for sure, there's probably prisons. Show me a province, state, or county that doesn't have a prison. We do. I've been in hundreds of prisons. I worked for the police for 10 years. I worked in the security industry in Australia for 18 years. I've literally been in hundreds and hundreds of prisons. I've transferred prisoners. I've seen how that's done. And it requires discipline.
Would you yourself live in Xinjiang?
No, I wouldn't. But that's not because of the issues that are there. It's because there's nothing. I've never had a desire to live in Xinjiang. I don't like the climate in Xinjiang. It's extremely hot and dry, and then it gets extremely cold and wet. There's nothing to attract me to Xinjiang in terms of living. Would I live in Saudi Arabia? No. Similar. And that's the sort of
right.
The answer I would give you there is no, but not for the reasons of the security. I would feel very safe. I do feel very safe when I'm there.
So if the same security apparatus was built in the place where you're living, you wouldn't consider moving. You'd be happy to stay.
I would, yeah, because this is my home. I own an apartment here. My wife and her family are from here. We have. I don't have any job to do now, but I have all my connections here. This is my base. Now, if they built that level of security, would I like it? Of course not. I wouldn't like it at all. But would I move? Probably not. If they said to me, you can't use a VPN and you can't use your Twitter account and things like that, then I might consider it, because my lifeline to the outside world is through the internet. But so far, there's never been a need to do that. And in Guangdong, where I do live, honestly, it's very, very safe. There's hardly any crime here. If there's a crime, and you're talking about pickpockets get reported in the local paper and the local news. And in London, pickpockets were happening 50 times a day. Robberies were happening all over the place. Again, this is a safe place. Why is it safe? Because we're monitored everywhere we go.
So Jerry, I'm curious about how you. You've just got off a phone call, I believe, with CGTN, did you say? And
I was going to. That's coming after you now.
Okay, no problem. And I saw that you were featured on the Global Times as well, and obviously you've got your Twitter account. And I was wondering, when did you start to kind of build up a following? How did you go from just being a cyclist to suddenly being kind of, I mean, I would almost describe you as an influencer.
I wouldn't say I'm an influencer yet, not with 4,000 followers. When I got 45,000 followers, maybe. It all happened by accident. I actually wrote, I put onto my medium.com, it was a clickbait title, How Did I Become Such an Expert on Xinjiang? And I opened the story, the article, with the words, actually, I'm not. The fact is, I'm just a cyclist, and so is my wife, and so is my friend, and we cycle through and we read these stories and we say, that doesn't look like the Xinjiang we know. It doesn't look like the Xinjiang we saw. So how did I become an influencer, as you call me? Simply because I was online and somebody right at the very beginning said, you're not allowed to cycle through Xinjiang. And I said, I beg to differ, I just did, here's photographs. Now, if I went back to Xinjiang now, I would go back as a very different person with a very different view. I would be looking for issues. I went there to ride a bike, and the photographs that we've taken are us riding bikes. The videos that we've got are us riding bikes. Or we might be taking photographs in restaurants or at places that we stopped. But we didn't actually go there with a view to being journalists and exposing some kind of story. And I have to tell you, Isabel, if somebody can take this story and find the root of I think the propaganda is a better word than lies, but certainly there are mistruths in this, and certainly there are misunderstandings in this. If someone can unravel this, go to Xinjiang as a journalist and expose this for what it is, there's a Pulitzer Prize in it. This is like the Wall Street, Washington Post story when they found the weapons of mass destruction weren't true. That's how strongly I feel about this. There are serious problems in Xinjiang. I never argue with that. There have been terrorists. Many of them ended up in Turkey. As you may know, there are a lot of them ended up in Turkey. There are a lot of dissidents around the world. There's a lot of stories around the world. But the fact is, no one has been to Xinjiang and asked the Xinjiang people what they think. I just a little while ago, I watched an HBO special, a guy called John Oliver. Do you know John Oliver? I don't think he quoted you, but he quoted your sources as well. And he's talking about this. And I just put a reply to his twit about it, that this is the biggest load of twaddle I've ever seen. Totally uncorroborated. Everything is corroborated by this one person, and it's Adrian Zenz. If we go back to that source and say, let's really analyze what he's got from the viewpoint of the way the Chinese government is saying it. Now, please believe I am no great supporter of the Chinese government, but they have lifted millions of people out of poverty. And I know that for a fact because I've cycled through Gansu, Ningxia, I've cycled through Xinjiang. I've seen their poverty alleviation schemes in action. It is definitely true. So if that part is true, the propaganda about Xinjiang and what's going on could also be true.
Right.
If you cycle through Ningxia, for example, and you see the number of new houses. When I was there a few years ago, people were still living in caves. I'm not kidding you. This is 2014. People lived in caves. I can show you pictures of it. Now there are houses where those caves were. There are shopping centers. There are cars driving around there. But 5 years ago, people still lived in caves. And they had donkeys and carts. You hardly ever see a donkey cart now because everyone's got an electric bike or electric cart.
Jerry, you talk about propaganda and Western propaganda about Xinjiang, but do you ever worry, that you yourself are being used as a propaganda tool? I mean, if China has all this evidence that everything that the West is saying isn't true, why are they using a cyclist to show that Xinjiang is a safe and happy place?
Nobody's using me, Isabel. Nobody's using me. The CGTN thing came about the same day that you met me. The Global Times thing is only 2 weeks ago. I've been talking about this for weeks. Nobody's using me. I don't feel like I'm being used. I'm talking to you for the opposite point of view. and I'm talking to them. They want to talk to me because I support their point of view. Now, what are CGTN and Global Times and China Daily and pretty much every single government department and government media, what are they doing? They're pushing out pictures of Uyghurs dancing and pictures of Uyghurs celebrating and pictures of Uyghurs telling them how well they're getting on now that they've been re-educated. Now, their propaganda department absolutely sucks. And I think maybe I'm being used, but I'm being used to deliver a message that I believe in rather than I'm being told what message to deliver. And that's the difference. So if they are using me, I'm being used as a targeted arrow. I'm not being used they're not telling me what to say. They're asking me what I think. And I'm telling them the same as I tell you. Mm-hmm. Now, you can use the information that I give you one way or another. You can cherry pick all the bits that say, yes, there are some problems with the Chinese government. Yes, there are some problems in Xinjiang. Yes, security is terrible. But I can tell you that if you wrote like that, I would probably be saying in response, this is not in context. The context is that those things that are happening as a result of a necessity. I wish the London police, Metropolitan Police, had been able to do that when I was a member of the Metropolitan Police, and people like Airy Neve would still be alive, and the horse guards and the horses that I once saw getting made mincemeat out of. I went to that bombing in Hyde Park. I was there and saw it. I don't ever want to see shit like that again in my life. So that kind of thing, if we had a way of stopping that back in the 1970s, I would have been pretty happy about that. And if that meant controlling the population as a police officer and being part of that control, I probably would have been okay. As a member of the public living in it, probably not. So it just depends on the perspective of where you come from. But honestly, how do I feel about being used as a propaganda tool? I'm just telling it as it is. I'm telling it as I see it, I should say. I don't see myself as a propaganda.
We haven't really talked about what your specific criticisms are. Like, what do you think? What do you think that there's anything that you wouldn't anything wrong with the way that the Xinjiang authorities have responded to this threat of terrorism?
Well, to be quite honest, I don't know if there's anything wrong with it or if it's right. I have to be realistic here and say I'm not an expert on this. I'm an observer, of course, but I'm not an expert on this. What I've seen in Xinjiang is that there are millions of people who are Uyghurs, and the ones I saw seemed relatively happy. They didn't seem oppressed when I talked to them. They were happy to talk to me. We've got photographs of them. We've got photographs of Uyghur policemen. We had a kind of charity flag, and I've got a photograph, you can find it on my Twitter feed, of the Uyghur policemen. I've blanked their faces out for security. But I've got photographs of the Uyghur policemen and us with our flag, and this is part of our charity. And they were so helpful and friendly. They gave us tea, gave us fruit, topped up our water bottles, and said, you might want to consider which way to go, because this one's a really bad road for trucks, and this one's a much better, more scenic route. But they didn't tell us which one to choose. They didn't say you can't go there. They were very friendly and helpful. And so we took their advice. I don't think if we'd have gone the other way that there would have been a problem. There was one place where we weren't allowed to stay, and that was a bit oppressive. We had to move from one town and cycle another 30 kilometers to the main town, so the village wouldn't allow us to stay there. And that happens all over China. You find hotels that aren't able to take foreigners, and in this little village they had no hotel to take a foreigner. And so we'd cycled all day, nearly 100 kilometers, and we had to do another 30 kilometers. That's a bit of a pain, but hey, that's their security. We didn't like it. We complained bitterly as we're cycling out of town, going, but hey, that's what we had to do.
It's interesting. I was going to ask. I'm blanking on what I was going to ask you next. So tell me a little bit more about your life online a little bit. You said about Shifan that she was I think you called her your comrade in arms, and I was wondering, is there
no, there's not a community out there. There's just a group of people who like each other's tweets. That's all we are. Just to put you in perspective here, I didn't use Twitter at all. I opened a Twitter account in 2015. I was in the UK and I just bought a new bike. and it was a foldable bike. And my plan at that stage was to bring my new bike back to China and do a lot of riding. And I was going to Twitter about my ridings, or tweet about my riding. And my original Twitter name was Jerry Honor Brompton. I don't know if you know the Brompton bike brand.
Yeah.
So I bought one of those, and I think I've got the only one in southern China. So that was my plan. But when I got back to China, things changed. I got a new job, a totally different experience. Things happened, and it didn't happen the way I wanted it to happen. So I didn't touch Twitter again. And in March of this year, February of this year, I went to Thailand for a couple of weeks, because a friend of mine said there's an opportunity here for a job. You just got to come along, have an interview. Gave me a break for a holiday, but COVID was hitting at the time. I got out of China, no problem. I got into Thailand, no problem. And then the day I got into Thailand, they pretty much said, no, we're not going to be employing anyone from China. So thanks for coming, but forget about it. So I had a 2-week holiday there and then came home. And I was locked in quarantine for 2 weeks because I'd been out of China and I'd come back to China. So I was locked into quarantine. I had my tests 3 times. The local community came to visit me every day, take my temperature, check I wasn't doing anything wrong. My wife had to go and live in another apartment. She wasn't allowed to stay with me. And I was bored silly, so I opened up my Twitter account and thought, I know what I'll do. One of the things I can do is I can start tweeting about the bike ride that we just had. And so my plan there was to start on day 1, and every single day I would tweet 2 tweets on my bike ride. But at the time I had 2 followers, and one of them was my brother. A day later I had 3 followers, and 2 of them were my brothers. Within a couple of weeks I had 17 followers, and then I got out of my lockup. But by then people were asking me questions. You went to Xinjiang. What was it like? What happened there? So I started answering questions. Now, 4 months later, I have 4,000 followers, and many of them are Chinese. They're not all Chinese in China, but a lot of them are. And Shifan is one of those. She's in Adelaide, I think. We don't talk about very much. I never actually send her messages or chat with her. We're not good mates, but I saw the communication going on between the 2 of you, and I know that she's had the same as me. We get these trolls, and they're mostly Indians or Hong Kongers. And as far as we're concerned, as far as they're concerned, we are just lying government bots, and we should shut up, and we can, all the nasty words. I just block. But occasionally I'll enter a discourse or discussion with 1 or 2 of them. If I think, I've also entered discussions with some very, very senior academics. I've got a guy in a university in Hawaii who is a member of a think tank that advises government on policy. And I keep saying to him, well, have you been to Xinjiang? His answer is no. I haven't been to the Mars either. But I know what goes on there. So, well, you don't know what goes on there because you haven't been. You're the experts. And these people keep telling me to prove things. And I say, well, no. I'm not trying to advise governments. I'm not making a living teaching students about this. I'm not an expert. You prove to me that I'm wrong. Because if you can't, then you can't do your job. Because I'm telling you, I think you're wrong. You're uninformed or ill-informed or even misinformed. And if you are, then how can you justify what you're saying? There is no forced labor that I'm aware of, but there is poverty alleviation. Now, which way do we look at that? You get a chance. Now, to understand this, you really need to understand the culture of China, not Xinjiang, but China. There's a massive annual migration of workers from the countryside into the cities. They work and they spend 12 months working, and this is very, very common for parents to be separated from their children for 1 to 2 years. They come into the cities, they live in dormitories, they can do whatever they want when they're not working. They work overtime. Do you remember a few years ago the BBC report about Foxconn, when people were sleeping at their desks because they were so tired, because they were working like slaves 7 days a week? It was total rubbish. Every single factory I've been in, and I worked for 3 years in industry here, I've worked in all kinds of different aspects, not just teaching. Every single factory I've ever been in, every school I've ever worked in, everybody has their little sleep arrangement at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 12 till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They have lunch, have a sleep. It's a very common thing. This is not slave labor. Look at this. This guy's so tired, he's sleeping at his desk. Every person does. Now, usually they'll find a piece of cardboard and stretch out on the floor. That's common. It's very common. And the same thing with the migrant labor. Now, I saw pictures, and you've probably seen the same pictures, of these migrants arriving in a city and then getting off the bus and going into their factory, and people are clapping at them. Well, why are they clapping at them? What is this? Is this some sort of a government game to say, welcome, welcome prisoners, welcome to Auschwitz? It's not. It's because they probably have volunteered to come here for 6 or 12 or 18 months to work in this factory. They've signed a contract. They're going to work there. They're going to earn more money than they would have earned in 5 years at home. And then they'll go home and do something with that money. Mm-hmm. That is the fact of Chinese life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jerry, I want to wrap up soon because I'm aware of your time. I guess I want to close by asking you, if these reports that are coming out of Xinjiang, and I think if you've read any of them, they're pretty terrible things that are being reported coming out of Xinjiang, with forced female sterilization, mass internment, mass imprisonment, and huge programs of re-education. And if you and obviously what you've seen as well, which is this huge surveillance state, which is a human rights question in itself. And if things are worse than you yourself experienced on your bike ride, and it turns out that you were on the wrong side of history, do you ever worry about that?
Yeah, I do, every day. I do. What I've seen, what I've observed, what I've talked about with the people that I've talked to indicate to me that this is not what's going on. Now, it's possible that they lied to me. It's possible that they're afraid to tell the truth. But that's the reason why I told you my background. I have some psychology training. I have some criminal investigation training. I'm a serving police officer for 10 years. I've got a master's degree which incorporates cross-cultural management. I don't know if anyone could lie to me that often and that well and me not notice. In my opinion, the issues about the genocide, the issues about I'll tell you one thing about the language. There is absolutely no way that the language is being genocided. No way at all. That is simply not true, because everybody there speaks Uyghur. Everywhere you go, you see Uyghur. Every restaurant, every television show that's on has a Uyghur language. Every kid is speaking Uyghur to their parents because we can't understand a word that they're saying. So there's one example that I know for a fact is a lie. Then we had this issue with the fake hair. Suddenly the fake hair, it was, at first the stories were coming out that this was hair that had been shorn off prisoners and sent to America for their beauty products. Then suddenly, no, it's actually not real hair, it's fake hair, but it's been done by forced labor. Well, I know that the factory where that hair came from was actually visited by and investigated by the World Bank. So if the World Bank are going there and lending money and seeing people and talking to people in the factory, then that tells me that perhaps I'm not wrong. I also know for a fact, an absolute fact, that I've seen several different examples of factories, one of which was in Brazil, but it was touted as being a forced labor factory in Xinjiang, and it's been proven now to be in Brazil. Another one was a group of prisoners who were being marched down the street. And I remember watching that 3 years ago. It was a pyramid scheme that they all got arrested and they were taken from somewhere else. This is stuff that we can say, that's a lie. That one is not even a mistake. That's a lie. Now, if people are prepared to tell those lies about stuff that can be easily found out, isn't it possible that some of the other things that we're being told could be lies too? Especially given that I traveled clearly without any restriction, without anybody stopping me, without anybody asking to see my camera, without any sort of necessary visa or permit to go anywhere. We slept in the desert. We slept under a bridge. We slept in a restaurant. We were completely unescorted, unregistered, and they didn't know where we were. So
do you think
why
you would
was
have
that
been
allowed?
treated differently? Do you think you would have been treated differently if you'd been Uyghur?
I have no idea. I don't know. The Uyghurs that we spoke to didn't seem to have a problem. Remember, there are 11 to 12 million Uyghurs there. There is absolutely no evidence, no real evidence, no hard evidence to suggest that 1 million of them are in camps. This is a number that Adrian Zenz has extrapolated from 8 interviews, from what I've understood from reading. Now, I've become something of an expert on this because I'm looking at where my sources are different to, or not my sources, where my ideas are different to sources of other stories. So if Adrian Zenz has interviewed 8 people and extrapolated the number of 1 million, and now other reports are saying up to 3 million, the BBC says more than 1 million, ABC in Australia says 1.5 million. My only comment to that is, who's been there and seen this? Now, okay, maybe you can't see this, but who's been there and asked the people who are there? Not a single reporter.
And I think that's the catch-22, isn't it? Because it's I usually write up to 1 million or as many as 1 million, but does these reports, the UN believes they're quite credible. Does that mean they're correct? Who knows? Only Beijing knows for sure, and they're not telling. So
no. The UN does not believe they're credible. One lady in the UN Human Rights Organization believes they're credible and says they're credible. That's not the UN, because the UN Counterterrorism Department said this is not credible. His name was Vladimir Voronkov. Go online and look up him. Vladimir Voronkov is the chief of the Counterterrorism Department of the United Nations. He's a serious man. He knows what he's looking at, and he says this isn't credible, but his report's been shelved because human rights say he's given validity to the Chinese regime. Let's not call it a Chinese party. Bear in mind, 93% of Chinese people who have been polled actually like their government. So let's stop calling it a regime and start calling it a Chinese party, which is what it is. It's a communist party. 90 million, 92 million people are in it, and more people want to join all the time. These are people who like their government.
Okay. Jerry, before we end, do you think I could just get a few sort of timeline details? First of all, sure. So you said you'd been in China since 2004 and you worked for an Australian company before that. Do you mind if I ask what the company was? Or what industry it was?
It was actually a British company called Chubb Security.
Oh,
I worked for Chubb Security for, everybody knows Chubb, yeah. I worked for them for 18 years in Australia. I went there in 1987. I started my life as a security guard, obviously with police background. That was an easy job for me to get. I finished my life there 18 years later as a general manager of a division called Chubb Traffic Management Services.
So, and what did that involve?
It was related to parking infringement, traffic management, enforcement of parking regulations in some cities, some universities, some hospitals. We had a range, and we also managed some traffic control and things like that. It was basically 2 different parts. One was manpower, one was high tech.
Okay. And so you moved to Australia in 1987, is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so prior to that, you were a police officer in the London Met?
From 77 to 82 in the Met, and 82 to 87 in Essex. I receive a pension from the Essex Police.
Oh, that's nice.
That's how I live.
And how old are you, Jerry, if you don't mind me asking?
62. Born in 58, I'm 62 years old. I was 18 and a half when I joined the police and 28 when I went to Australia.
And then when you got to China, so you initially worked as a teacher?
Correct.
In a school, or?
Yes, first year was in a school, an international school here, but it was on a contract with an Australian company, and it was basically a feeder for the University of New South Wales. So I worked for the company but not for the university. I worked for a company that was subcontracted through a company. It was quite a complicated system.
Okay.
But it was an Australian contract.
That was just for the first year? And then after that, what?
Set up my own business. We ran a language center and a coffee shop here for a little while, and then I went back into education. Do you know the IELTS exam?
Yes.
I was an IELTS examiner for a while. I also was a training manager for a factory here, which is the factory I used for my master's degree. So the training in all kinds of engineering fields. I
Mm-hmm.
helped to build that company through its training department. I was the training department. I've also been a teacher trainer, so I teach
Okay.
TEFL course.
Okay.
Many
Yeah.
of my students are people like yourself who've traveled somewhere, spend a year there, work as a teacher, and then I don't know if you did that, but a lot of people like yourself do. They spend a year getting a bit of experience, but before they do, they have to learn how to be a teacher, and that was my role.
Do you speak Mandarin? Say again?
A little.
A little.
A little, yes. Ask my wife; she'll say no, he doesn't. Do I speak Cantonese? No. I understand a lot of what's going on around me. I've never trained. I've never been taught. I just picked up. I can certainly function as a Chinese speaker. When I'm out on my bike and stuff, I have no choice.
Can you read it or?
No, I can't read it at all.
Okay. And then when did you retire? What year?
2018.
2018. Okay.
Okay.
Great, Jerry. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Have you got CGTN now?
I have at 5 o'clock, yes.
Oh, okay, in 2 minutes. Sorry.
No problem.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your time.
No problem. If you have
much.
any follow-up questions, by all means, put them on there. And it has been nice talking to you. And I'm sorry if I feel a little evangelical about it. I just feel that seriously, it needs somebody, maybe someone like yourself, to seriously look into this and say, yes, there are problems, but the problems are not what the world is currently seeing. That's not the problem. I don't believe all of those things about the forced labor and the sterilizations. I don't believe them. I can't prove them either way. But I think somebody needs to come and do that. And I'm sure if you're going to write a proper piece, then the Chinese government, after COVID, of course, would welcome you.
Okay. All right, Jerry. Thanks again.
Because obviously I'm becoming a spokesman for the Chinese government, according to you. You can say I've spoken to Jerry Gray, one of your spokespersons.
All right, Jerry. Well, have a good rest of your afternoon. It was nice talking to you too. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your time. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.